All right, so you guys have to learn how to analyze a nutrition label so that you don't just trust whatever claims the box makes, but so that you get good at determining whether something's healthy or not on your own with your own skill set. So your assignment is to take 2 foods that you already eat. You should try to find one that you think is probably healthy and one that you think may not be so healthy. And what you're going to go through is you're going to go through each step of looking at the nutrition facts label and determine whether or not, based on actual evidence, the food is healthy or not. So I've picked a food from my own cabinet that I like to eat every day, and I think it's fairly healthy, but I'm really going to analyze this label, and I'm going to show you guys how to do it. So by the end of your work, you will have a similar analysis of 2 different foods, and that's what you're going to turn in for a class. So the food I chose is this cereal that I like to eat called Flax Plus Maple Pecan Crunch. And this is the side panel of the box. And so the first things that I'm going to look at, the way they've ordered this is under the name of the food, we've got these claims they're making. So we've got excellent source of ALA omega-3, whole grain, high fiber. We're still in the advertising section of the label up here. So we can kind of ignore this. And what we really care about is the boring looking list of ingredients and then the boring looking nutrition facts. So we're going to ignore anything that's screaming at us to try and buy this food, trying to convince us that it's healthy, and we're going to see if it really is. So first I get down here to the ingredients list. Now, by law, these companies have to list their ingredients in a certain order. Whatever they list first, so in this case it says whole wheat meal, that is if you took all the ingredients of the cereal and you separated them out and you weighed them, whichever ingredient weighs the most, so your biggest, heaviest pile, has to be listed first. Whatever's the second heaviest pile has to be second. So the ingredients list isn't random. It's not in alphabetical order. It's ranked by how much of that is in the food. So if something appears very early in the list, it means there's a lot of it. If it appears very far down in the list, it means there's not very much of it. So in this case, I've got whole wheat meal, rolled oats, so a couple of grains, and then next I have cane sugar. Now, sugar is not something I want a lot of in my diet, so I would rather that sugar were not in the top 3 or 4 ingredients, but in this food it is. And then from there we go on to wheat bran, pecans, flax meal, soy oil, so those all sound pretty good to me. Maple syrup, so that's another source of sugar. It's not listed as sugar. So already I've got 2 sources of sugar. I've got some salt in there. I've got what looks like a lot of different grains. So for the most part, I want to look at those first few ingredients and figure out, is there anything in there that kind of alarms me? And in this case, yeah, I'd prefer not to have sugar being a top ingredient. In this food, I've got a lot of these little asterisks, these little stars next to the names of things. And I come down here and I see that that star tells me that that particular ingredient is organic. So not every single thing in here has a star next to it, but most of the ingredients, excuse me, are organic. And we'll talk later about whether or not you want to care about that, whether that's important to you or not. And then they give the little allergy statement where they say contains wheat, soy, and tree nuts. So if you were a person, and produced in a facility that uses peanuts. So if you were a person who was allergic to any of those things, you'd want to know that. So in this case, I'm just going to make my note on my paper. So this is what you guys will do. I'll say, okay, organic, maybe that's good, and sugar, third ingredient, not so good. So that's what I have there for my ingredients list. Now we're going to move on to the nutrition facts themselves. So we're going to look at the top part of your ingredients list. Let me just straighten this out so we can see more what's going on. Let's get our ingredients list here. All right, so again, there's a certain order where they have to do things. And in this case, in the nutrition facts, here you'll see, first they tell you the serving size. So for this cereal, 3/4 of a cup of dry cereal is what they're defining as 1 serving. So my job there is to say, okay, but that, I take that and I say, I actually eat, I measured it out and I eat about 1.5 cups at a time. So I have to keep in mind that they're defining 3/4 of a cup of dry cereal, pour that in a bowl, maybe add some milk. That's what they're defining as a serving. But I'm saying that in real life, when I pour myself a bowl of cereal, I measured it out and I determined that I don't put 3/4 of a cup in my bowl. I put 1.5 cups of dry cereal in my bowl, and then I add my almond milk. So this isn't necessarily all going to be accurate for me, or it's not going to be accurate for me, because I'm eating quite a bit more, double, what the serving size says. So let's say I'm eating double what the serving size says. I have to keep in mind that for all these numbers that they calculated, all these numbers were calculated as if I'm only eating 3/4 of a cup. And if I'm actually eating twice as much of that, then all these things have to double. So that means anything that's good for me, nutritious, I'm getting twice as much of it. But anything that's not so good for me, I'm going to be getting twice as much of, and that's not great. So that's what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come down to these nutrients. Now I've got two columns here, the cereal itself, and then I've got the cereal plus skim milk. So if I wanted to know I'm having my bowl of cereal with milk and I wanted the nutrients for that combination, I would look at this column. But I'm looking just at the cereal itself column. So I'm interested in these because I just want to know the dry cereal. So the first thing they tell me up here is that in 3/4 of a cup of cereal, there are 220 calories. Now I have to remember that everything's double. So I'm actually getting 440 calories, pretty substantial. It's going to tell you your calories from fat too, and we will talk more about whether or not that's super critical and what the deal with fat is. But for now, look down here. So the thing we're going to focus on as we move through these nutrients, fat, cholesterol, sodium, potassium, all that stuff, is these percent daily values. So the percent daily values are saying that if you eat one serving, so remember 3/4 of a cup by their definition, one serving of this particular food, and you have a diet of 2,000 calories per day that you need to take in, then this food is going to give you these percentages of each of these nutrients. So let's say for carbohydrate, if you eat 3/4 of a cup of this cereal, that serving of cereal is going to give you 13% of your daily carbs. And that assumes you're taking in 2,000 calories a day. Now, for me, I don't need 2,000 calories a day. I'm a smaller person than that. So this number is not going to be super accurate for me, but these percentages give you a reference point. They give you a sense of, does this have a lot of that particular nutrient, not a lot, or something in the middle? So we need some guidance here on how to tell which of these percentages seem high and which seem low. And there is a rule we can use called the 5-20 rule. So we're going to use the 5-20 rule. And if something comes in at less than 5%, that means it's a low source of that particular nutrient. If something comes in at more than 20%, that means it's a high source of that nutrient. Now notice I don't say a good or bad source because you've got two different categories of nutrients. There are certain things in your diet that you want lots of. They're really healthy. There's really no limit to how much of them you can eat. The more, the better. And in that case, if you've got more than 20% for a particular healthy nutrient, then that's great. You want that. You should eat that food. But let's say that we're talking about something like sodium, which is something you want to limit in your diet. If a food is giving you more than 20% of your daily value of sodium, that's a problem. Not that you can never eat it, but you really have to be aware that that food is really hitting you pretty hard with the sodium. So that's the reference we're going to use. We're going to use this 5-20 rule, and we're going to progress down this column and figure out which nutrients come in as low sources for that particular thing, and which come in high, and which are sort of in the middle. So going through here, we just look and see what catches our eye. So we've got 11% for total fat. That's between 5 and 20, so it means it's not a really low source of fat, so it's not really a low-fat food. But it's also not super fatty because it's not over 20%. So it's sort of middle of the road for fat. Saturated fat, so we've got these things that we're trying to monitor where we don't want them to get too high. So saturated fat is one of the things where you can have some of it in your diet, but you really would like it to be as low as possible. So saturated fat, we want that to be as low as it can be. 5% is right at the edge of our 5-20 rule. So this food is not a huge source of saturated fat, but there is some in there. And then we come down here, cholesterol is another one of those things we want to limit. And this has 0%. So that's great. That's something we don't want a lot of in our diet, and this food doesn't give us any of it. So that's a positive. Sodium comes in at 8%. So again, it's not below 5, so it's not a low sodium food. It's not above 20, so it's not a super high sodium food. It's sort of in the middle ground. And sodium's something we want to keep an eye on. So, we kind of register that and say, that's all right, I guess. Same thing for potassium, except potassium is something that you do want in your diet. So you kind of have to keep track. You might want to keep a little cheat sheet of which nutrients you want a lot of and which you want to limit. Because sodium and potassium appear right next to each other on a lot of labels. Sodium we don't want a lot of. Potassium we do want. That's very valuable to the body. So now we've got carbohydrate. Carbohydrate comes in at 13%. So again, it's not below 5. It's not above 20. So it's not a crazy low or a crazy high source of carbs. So we're kind of okay with that. And then we come down to fiber, and fiber's right at 20%. So for fiber, we're right at the ceiling of that 5-20 rule, where if it goes above 20%, that means it's a really good source of that particular thing, a high source of that kind of thing. And since we're looking at fiber, and fiber is one of those things you do want in your diet, that means this is good news, because 20% is a pretty good amount of fiber, and I want fiber in my diet. So that's a positive. And then we do the same thing with the vitamins. So same thing applies to the vitamins. If it's less than 5%, it's a very low source of that particular thing. If it's more than 20%, it's a very high source of that particular thing. And if it's anything between 5 and 20, it's just sort of middle of the road. So iron comes in at 15%, so it's a fairly good source of iron, but calcium, vitamin C, and vitamin A, this cereal really isn't giving you any of that. So I've kind of charted through. I figured out that, at least here it's a pretty good fiber source. So that's good. And most everything else doesn't really jump out at me. There's not like any whoa, that's crazy kind of values here. But what I do have to remember is that for all of these things, so for everything here, I'm doubling these. Why am I doubling these? Because I don't eat 3/4 of a cup. I eat 1.5 cups at a time. So I have to look at all these numbers and say, all right, these are all true if I only eat 3/4 of a cup. But if I eat 1.5 cups at a sitting, then in that serving of cereal in my bowl, I'm getting twice as much on all these percentages. And if I do that, then I double these things. So then this becomes 22%. This becomes 10%. This stays 0. This goes to 16%. So this is getting kind of messy. 14%. Carbs is going to go up to 26%. And fiber is going to go up to 40%. So that's good news, because my fiber is already a pretty good fiber source. And if I'm eating twice as much of the cereal as the label is talking about, then I'm getting twice as much fiber. So 40% of my daily value for fiber, awesome. Carbs, when I double my carbs because I'm eating twice as much cereal, my carbs go up to 26%. So by my 5-20 rule, that means it's a pretty high source of carbs in my diet. Now that doesn't really mean good or bad, because carbs are a mixed bag. Carbs includes your fiber, your sugars, which I'm not a big fan of, and then also things like starches and stuff like that. So that's a little more complex. But once I go up above that 20%, it means it's something I need to pay attention to. So I go through that whole process. I figure out if anybody, once I double these numbers, is going to be kind of alarming. Down here on the vitamins, I find that if I double it, if I'm eating a double serving, I'm going to get 30% of my daily value for iron. So that's good, because I want iron in my diet. And if I'm above 20%, it's a pretty good source of it. So that's kind of what you're going to do as you go through your food labels, and hopefully it will look a little less crazy town than this does over here. So you're going to go piece by piece. You're going to do the ingredients list. You're going to look at the serving size, decide if that's really what you eat. Look at the calories, look at all these different nutrients. Use your 5-20 rule to figure out if that's a lot or a little of each of those nutrients. And you're going to do a little write-up on that. So that's the basics of how to approach a nutrition facts label. It's not the most exciting part of the box, but it is the most informative part of the box. And it's the part of the box that's least likely to be misleading you and just trying to get you to spend your money.